It was a quiet Saturday morning on March 22, 2014. The small community of Oso, Washington, sat peacefully about 4 miles east of the main town center, tucked beside the North Fork of the Stillaguamish River. The neighborhood just south of the river, known as Steelhead Haven, was mostly made up of families and longtime residents who loved the peacefulness of living out there in the woods. The weather had been wet for weeks, nearly double. The usual rainfall had fallen over the previous month and a half, but nobody was too alarmed. Rain in western Washington wasn't anything new. At 10:37 that morning, everything changed. Without any warning, a huge chunk of the hillside just north of Steelhead Haven suddenly gave way. In seconds, a wave of mud, trees, and broken earth came roaring across the river like a wall of destruction. People who saw it later described it as sounding like a freight train. Others called it a tsunami made of dirt. The river didn't stand a chance. It was swallowed up. The mud barreled forward, slamming directly into the neighborhood. In just moments, 49 homes and structures were buried under the thick, wet earth. Everything in its path disappeared. The debris covered an area nearly 1 square mile wide. That's about the size of 700 football fields, just to picture it. And the mud didn't just sit on top, it dug in deep, as much as 70 feet in some spots. People miles away felt the ground shake. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network picked up the vibrations from the collapse almost instantly. Later on, scientists figured out the initial slide had lasted around 2.5 minutes, but there were aftershocks and smaller slides that continued for hours. Emergency responders were on the scene as fast as they could get there. Helicopters from the nearby Naval Air Station on Whidbey Island flew in, and local firefighters and medics from all over Snohomish County rushed to help, but the situation was already devastating. What they found was a complete disaster zone. In those first few hours, 8 people were pulled from the debris alive. That gave families hope. But as the day turned to night, it became clear that many people had not made it out in time. 43 lives were eventually lost, making this the deadliest single landslide in American history, not caused by an earthquake, volcanic eruption, or dam collapse. By that night, the state's Lieutenant Governor Brad Owen had declared a state of emergency. The next day, Governor Jay Inslee flew over the site in a helicopter to see the damage himself. What he saw from the sky was unimaginable. What had once been a quiet rural neighborhood now looked like the aftermath of a natural bomb going off, just a sea of broken trees, twisted houses, and endless mud. And this was only the beginning. After the deadly landslide hit Oso on the morning of March 22, 2014, the scene left behind was nearly impossible to believe. Trees were ripped from the ground like weeds. Homes had been picked up and tossed or buried under thick, heavy layers of mud and debris. It wasn't just a collapse, it looked like the land itself had exploded. What once had been a peaceful riverside neighborhood, known as Steelhead Haven, was now an unrecognizable field of destruction stretching over 1 square mile. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, even though access was incredibly difficult. The massive flow of mud had completely blocked off State Route 530, the main road in and out of the area. This made it nearly impossible for emergency crews to get to the site quickly. Some responders had to arrive by helicopter. Others took back roads through the mountains, some of which were still covered in snow. Despite the danger, more than 100 first responders showed up that day from all around Snohomish County and neighboring counties. Firefighters, police, paramedics, and volunteers all joined forces. Even the Navy's search and rescue team from Whidbey Island got involved. They all worked together, digging through the muck with whatever they had, from heavy equipment to their bare hands. As they worked, everyone was holding out hope for survivors. On that first day, 8 people were rescued from the debris and rushed to nearby hospitals. Some had been trapped in what was left of their homes. Others were found clinging to pieces of wood barely above the mud line. Every minute counted and the clock was ticking fast. But even as help poured in, the weather remained a major challenge. The ground was still soaked from weeks of rain leading up to the slide. It made the mud deep, sticky, and unstable. Equipment would get stuck, roads kept washing out, and the river itself, the North Fork of the Stillaguamish, had been completely blocked by the slide, creating a massive backup of water. Officials worried that if the natural dam gave way, it could cause even more damage downstream. A flash flood watch was issued just in case. Meanwhile, the community of Oso and nearby Darrington, a small mountain town about 16 miles east, were essentially cut off. Supplies had to be airlifted in, and families desperately waited for any word about their missing loved ones. The scope of the disaster became clearer by the hour. Entire families were unaccounted for. Some homes had vanished without a trace. As night fell on March 22nd, the Lieutenant Governor of Washington declared a state of emergency. The next day, Governor Jay Inslee flew over the scene. What he saw from the air was heartbreaking. A vast brown wasteland where a tight-knit neighborhood used to stand. And still, the rescuers worked. Mud-caked and exhausted, they searched on, refusing to give up hope. Behind them, the mountains stood silent, as if holding their breath. The search would only grow larger in the coming days, and the heartbreak deeper. In the days following the Oso Landslide, search and recovery efforts became a grueling, round-the-clock mission. Crews were no longer hoping for a miracle. They were now searching for the missing and trying to bring closure to grieving families. The wall of mud had buried everything under layers that reached up to 75 feet in some spots. The scale was staggering and the conditions remained brutal. As more federal resources arrived, including teams from FEMA and the National Guard, the operation grew in both size and complexity. Hundreds of workers took part in a carefully coordinated effort. Cadaver dogs were brought in to locate human remains. GPS mapping tools helped chart out the disaster zone in small sections. Every day, workers braved thick, unstable ground that could shift without warning. Heavy machinery slowly cleared debris, but many areas could only be reached by foot. Volunteers waded through cold, muddy water, searching for signs of life or loss. The river, still blocked by the natural dam, was rising slowly behind the slide, creating fears of a secondary flood. Engineers worked urgently to carve a new channel and relieve pressure on the fragile barrier. Meanwhile, the community pulled together in powerful ways. Churches opened their doors to families in need. Local restaurants cooked meals for rescue teams. Donations poured in from across the state and beyond. Blankets, supplies, and financial help for displaced residents. The town of Arlington, located west of the slide, became a staging point where families waited anxiously for news. Identification of the victims proved difficult. Many bodies were found far from where their homes had stood, carried by the force of the debris. Personal items, toys, clothing, photo albums were retrieved and set aside, each one a clue to someone's life. Medical examiners worked carefully to identify remains and provide answers to families who had been left in limbo. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people were confirmed dead. Dozens were still missing. Memorials began to appear on the roadside. Wooden crosses, flowers, and handwritten notes to the lost. Each name that was recovered brought both sorrow and a measure of peace to those waiting. There was also growing scrutiny over how such a tragedy could happen. Questions emerged about whether the area had been safe to build on in the first place. The hillside that collapsed had a long history of instability. Past slides had occurred in the same location, including one large event in the year 2006, but a few people seemed to have known the full risk, and now those decisions were under the microscope. Still, the focus remained on the people. The victims, the survivors, and the hundreds of workers doing the hard and heartbreaking job of recovery. Every shovel of mud, every item found, every name spoken aloud, it all mattered deeply. This was no longer just a rescue effort. It had become a solemn promise to honor those who were lost and stand by the families left behind. In the weeks that followed the Oso Landslide, Washington state and federal officials began a deeper investigation into what had gone wrong. The shock of the disaster gave way to tough questions. Questions about land use, environmental oversight, and public safety. Geologists and engineers were among the first to study the collapsed site in detail. They discovered that the slide had started high on a hillside, known to have moved before. Layers of loose, water-saturated soil had given way all at once. What had made this event different was its speed and violence. The slope did not slump gradually, it exploded outward in a single catastrophic motion. Experts found that rainfall had played a major role. March had been one of the wettest months on record in the region. The saturated ground became unstable, and the Stillaguamish River at the base of the hill had been slowly eroding the slope for years. When the collapse came on March 22nd, everything gave way in seconds, but the science led to harder truths. Public records showed that the area had experienced multiple landslides in the past. Some maps dated back to the 1940s and showed danger zones marked clearly. A particularly large slide in the year 2006 had left behind warning signs. Despite this, homes had been rebuilt and new permits had been issued. Residents later said they had not been warned about the full extent of the risk. Some knew there had been previous slides, but few understood just how unstable the ground truly was. That lack of communication became a central concern. State and local agencies had data, but it had not always been shared clearly or acted upon quickly enough. The tragedy also exposed weaknesses in building policies. There were no federal laws that prevented people from constructing homes in known landslide zones. Local regulations varied from county to county, and in rural areas like Oso, oversight was limited. The disaster showed how vulnerable communities could be when information and regulation failed to align. Public hearings were soon held. Survivors, scientists, and lawmakers spoke about what needed to change. There was a growing sense that better mapping, clearer warnings, and stricter construction rules were all essential to preventing another event like this one. Meanwhile, environmental specialists studied the long-term effects of the slide. The still Aguamish River had been rerouted by the debris, affecting fish habitats and downstream water quality. Replanting efforts began in damaged forest areas, but recovery would take years. The land, like the people, had been deeply scarred. As spring turned to summer, the investigation continued, and the focus gradually shifted from recovery to resilience. Washington State began reviewing land use policies. Experts pushed for stronger protections and better public awareness campaigns. The lessons from Oso were hard-earned, but they could not be ignored. Behind every technical report and policy change were the lives of the 43 people who had died. Each decision going forward carried the weight of their memory. The question was no longer what had happened. It was how to make sure it never happened again. Years after the Oso landslide, the community and state have worked to rebuild not just the physical landscape, but also the sense of safety and hope for the future. Memorials were established to honor the 43 lives lost, serving as reminders of the tragedy and the resilience of those left behind. In the aftermath, Washington lawmakers passed new regulations aimed at reducing risk in vulnerable areas. These policies required more comprehensive geological surveys before construction permits could be granted. Additionally, counties were mandated to improve emergency preparedness, including better evacuation plans for landslide-prone zones. Technology also played a growing role. Remote sensing tools such as LiDAR and satellite imaging became essential in monitoring hillside movement. These advancements helped experts identify early warning signs that might have gone unnoticed before. Public agencies began issuing alerts when unstable ground was detected, giving residents precious time to evacuate. Local schools and community centers incorporated landslide education into their programs. Teaching residents about natural hazards became a priority, fostering a culture of awareness. Drills were held regularly so families would know how to respond if a disaster struck again. Economically, the region faced challenges. The destruction of homes and infrastructure caused significant setbacks. However, investments in rebuilding efforts created new jobs and encouraged community revitalization. Infrastructure improvements, including stronger bridges and better drainage systems, helped protect against future floods and slides. Researchers continued to study Oso as a case example of landslide dynamics in a disaster response. Scientific papers published around the world referenced the event, contributing to global understanding of how such disasters unfold. The lessons learned have influenced safety practices far beyond Washington's borders. Despite progress, the memory of the landslide remains vivid. Survivors and families of victims carry their grief quietly but firmly. Community support groups formed, providing a space to share stories and heal together. Oso's story stands as a powerful warning. It shows how nature's forces can change lives in an instant, and how preparation, respect for science, and strong community ties are essential to facing the unknown. The legacy of the March 22, 2014 landslide is one of tragedy and hope. It is a call to action, to listen to the land, to act with urgency, and to remember those who can no longer speak for themselves. Through these efforts, Oso continues forward, determined to build a safer tomorrow.